The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers and the hum of a distant air conditioner. All eyes were on Judge Marcus Haynes, a tall, stoic figure with a reputation that preceded him. Known for his fairness and unshakable composure, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered countless storms, both in life and in the courtroom. But today, the air felt charged, like something extraordinary was about to unfold. Officer Jessica Morgan strode in, her polished uniform and sharp features exuding authority. She was the picture of confidence, maybe even arrogance. Jessica had built a career on her ability to command respect and maintain control in every situation. But as she took her place at the plaintiff's table, a hint of something else flickered across her face: contempt. It wasn't directed at the case or the courtroom, but at the man sitting behind the bench. Marcus noticed it immediately. He always did. That subtle shift in posture, the dismissive glance, the smirk that barely curled the corners of her lips. It wasn't new to him. He had seen this kind of disdain before, but this time it carried an edge that was hard to ignore. Jessica Morgan didn't just doubt his authority. She seemed to relish the idea of challenging it. The case at hand was a relatively minor dispute, one that should have been resolved quietly and efficiently. But from the moment Jessica opened her mouth, it became clear that this wouldn't be an ordinary hearing. Her tone was sharp, almost confrontational, as she recounted her version of the events. The audience exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension in the room. Marcus remained calm, his expression unreadable as he listened intently. He had heard every kind of testimony imaginable, from heartfelt confessions to outright lies. But Jessica's words weren't what stood out. It was the way she said them. There was a subtle but unmistakable undercurrent of superiority in her voice, as if she believed she was untouchable. She didn't just want to win the case, she wanted to prove a point. As the hours ticked by, Marcus's mind raced, though his demeanor never betrayed it. He knew this was about more than just the law. It was about respect, about understanding the weight of one's actions and words. And perhaps it was about something deeper, about challenging the assumptions and biases that often went unspoken, but were always felt. Jessica, for her part, seemed to grow bolder with each passing moment. She interrupted opposing counsel, dismissed questions she deemed irrelevant, and even took thinly veiled jabs at Marcus's authority. The audience, now fully engrossed, leaned forward in their seats, their curiosity piqued. Would the judge let her behavior slide, or would he finally put her in her place? When it was time for Marcus to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. He began slowly, his voice measured and deliberate. "Officer Morgan," he said, his gaze locking onto hers, "it's clear that you are passionate about your position. But passion without respect for this court, or for the truth, undermines the very justice you claim to uphold." Jessica's confident facade faltered, if only for a moment. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Marcus continued, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "In my courtroom, every individual, regardless of rank, title, or background, is held to the same standard. It's not about power, it's about integrity." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, her bravado now tempered by something else: uncertainty. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And as for my verdict," he said, pausing just long enough to make everyone lean in closer, "that will come in due time." The tension was palpable. No one dared to speak or move. The audience was left teetering on the edge of anticipation, their minds racing with questions. What would Marcus decide? How far would Jessica's arrogance take her? And most importantly, what lesson would emerge from this clash of egos and ideals? For now, though, the answers remained just out of reach, leaving everyone in the courtroom and watching at home, desperate for more. The courtroom's heavy silence lingered, broken only by the faint creak of Marcus's chair as he leaned back, his expression as steady as ever. Jessica Morgan's jaw tightened slightly, her frustration barely masked. She wasn't used to being called out, let alone so publicly. For years, she had operated with a sense of authority that few dared to challenge. But this judge, with his calm demeanor and unwavering gaze, was different. He wasn't rattled by her confidence or her subtle attempts to undermine him. The audience, a mix of curious spectators and those with a personal stake in the case, exchanged hushed whispers. It wasn't every day that such an intense standoff played out in court, especially between two figures who seemed so unshakable in their convictions. Yet beneath the surface, tension brewed, hinting at deeper layers of conflict. Marcus glanced down at the file before him, his fingers brushing lightly over the pages. The details of the case were straightforward on paper, but the dynamics in the room made it anything but simple. The dispute involved a young black man, Darren Carter, who claimed he had been unfairly detained by Jessica Morgan during a routine traffic stop. According to Darren, the stop had escalated unnecessarily, with Jessica displaying an abuse of power that left him humiliated and shaken. Jessica, on the other hand, insisted her actions were justified. She maintained that Darren had been uncooperative and that her conduct was strictly by the book. But as Marcus reviewed the evidence and listened to the testimonies, he couldn't ignore the glaring discrepancies. Darren's account was detailed and sincere, supported by video footage that painted a troubling picture. Jessica's version, though confident, seemed to gloss over critical moments, leaving more questions than answers. Marcus's mind drifted briefly to his own experiences, memories of moments when he had faced prejudice and doubt simply because of the color of his skin. He had worked tirelessly to rise above it, to prove himself in a system that often seemed stacked against him. And now, sitting on this bench, he felt the weight of responsibility, not just to uphold the law, but to ensure that justice was served in the truest sense. Jessica's voice snapped him back to the present. "Your Honor," she said, her tone edged with impatience, "I stand by my actions. I've served this community with integrity for over a decade. I don't appreciate having my character questioned based on one-sided accounts." Her words hung in the air, daring anyone to challenge her, but Marcus didn't flinch. He met her gaze steadily, his silence more powerful than any immediate rebuttal. Darren, seated quietly at the defense table, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being in spaces like this, where his every word and movement felt scrutinized. He had grown up in a neighborhood where trust in authority was fragile at best, and this experience had only deepened his skepticism. But as he looked at Marcus, he felt a sliver of hope. There was something about the judge's presence, a quiet strength, an unspoken understanding, that made him believe he might finally be heard. Meanwhile, Jessica's attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Paul Whitaker, leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She nodded slightly, her expression softening just enough to seem cooperative. But Marcus noticed the way her fingers tapped against the table, a subtle sign of her irritation. "I'd like to call attention to the footage again, Your Honor," Paul said smoothly, rising to his feet. "While my client has nothing to hide, I believe context is crucial. It's easy to misinterpret actions when they're viewed out of context." Marcus gestured for him to proceed, his face betraying no hint of his thoughts. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the video played once more on the large screen. The footage, captured by a passerby, showed Jessica approaching Darren's car with a rigid posture. Her tone, though professional, carried a sharpness that felt unnecessary, especially given Darren's calm demeanor. As the interaction unfolded, her attitude grew more assertive, even confrontational, while Darren's attempts to explain himself were repeatedly dismissed. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the video ended. Marcus' eyes lingered on the screen for a moment before returning to Jessica. "Officer Morgan," he said, his voice steady but firm, "what exactly were you responding to during the stop that warranted such an escalated approach?" Jessica hesitated, her composure faltering ever so slightly. "Your Honor, the area is known for high criminal activity. I was simply being cautious, given the circumstances." "And yet," Marcus replied, his tone unwavering, "Mr. Carter's behavior in the footage doesn't suggest he posed any immediate threat. In fact, he appears to be cooperating fully." Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I made a judgment call based on the information I had at the time. I can't be expected to second-guess myself in every situation." A murmur rippled through the audience, a mix of agreement and skepticism. Darren's mother, seated in the back row, clenched her fists tightly, her face a mask of restrained emotion. She had spent countless nights worrying about her son, praying he would come home safe in a world that often seemed stacked against him. Watching him sit there, vulnerable yet determined, only deepened her resolve. As he closed his notebook and prepared to leave, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle had only just begun. The courtroom may have been quiet for now, but the echoes of what had transpired there would reverberate far beyond its walls. And for Marcus, for Darren, and even for Jessica, the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom was quiet again as the next session convened, but the tension in the air was anything but subtle. The seats in the gallery were filled, and the anticipation was palpable. Word of the case had spread throughout the community, drawing in people who were eager to see how it would unfold. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of solidarity, and still more because they saw something of themselves in Darren Carter's story. Jessica Morgan sat at her table, her usually confident posture now tinged with a quiet unease. Her polished exterior remained intact, but her eyes betrayed the weight of the scrutiny she was under. Next to her, Paul Whitaker shuffled through a stack of papers, his face etched with focus. Across the room, Darren sat with his attorney, his mother beside him. Her hand rested gently on his, a silent gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the spectators. Darren's expression was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was no longer just defending himself, he was standing for something bigger, something that resonated deeply with everyone watching. Marcus Haynes entered the courtroom, his robe billowing slightly as he took his place at the bench. The room fell silent immediately. His gaze swept over the room, his expression unreadable. He had spent the night before reviewing every detail of the case, replaying the footage, and considering the testimonies. He knew the weight of his next steps, the impact it would have not just on the individuals before him, but on the community as a whole. Before we proceed, Marcus began, his voice steady. I want to remind everyone that this courtroom is a place for truth and justice. Let us conduct ourselves with respect for one another, regardless of the outcome. Jessica's attorney stood first, his voice crisp and measured as he recapped their arguments. He emphasized Jessica's years of service, her spotless record, and her intent to protect the community. He spoke with the challenges faced by law enforcement, painting a picture of a job that demanded split-second decisions in high-pressure situations. But as Paul spoke, Marcus' expression remained neutral. He listened carefully, his hands folded neatly in front of him. When the defense took the floor, the tone shifted. Darren's attorney, a passionate woman named Lisa, presented a compelling narrative that focused on accountability and systemic issues. She pointed to the footage, to the discrepancies in Jessica's testimony, and to Darren's behavior during the stop, calm, cooperative, and undeserving of the treatment he had received. The tension in the room grew as Lisa presented her final piece of evidence, additional footage from a nearby security camera. The new angle showed a clearer view of the interaction, capturing nuances that hadn't been visible before. It showed Jessica's body language, rigid, confrontational, and Darren's repeated attempts to comply, his hands visibly shaking as he followed her instructions. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the footage played. Her attorney leaned over, whispering something in her ear, but she didn't respond. Her jaw was tight, her eyes fixed on the screen. When the video ended, a heavy silence fell over the room. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. "Officer Morgan," he said, his voice calm but firm, "do you have anything to say about this footage?" Jessica hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. Finally, she straightened her shoulders and said, "Your Honor, I did what I thought was necessary at the time. I can't change how it looks now, but I stand by my actions." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in her tone. Marcus regarded her carefully, his expression giving nothing away. The session continued with closing arguments, each side presenting their final case. Paul emphasized Jessica's dedication and the difficulty of her job, while Lisa drove home the importance of accountability and the need to address the power imbalance that had been so painfully evident. By the time the arguments concluded, the room was charged with anticipation. Marcus announced a brief recess before delivering his verdict, and the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as people stepped out to stretch their legs. Jessica retreated to a quiet corner with Paul, her usually sharp demeanor now dulled by the weight of the proceedings. "What do you think he'll decide?" she asked, her voice low. Paul hesitated. "It's hard to say. He's thorough, and he's clearly not afraid to challenge authority. But we've made our case. Now we wait." Across the hall, Darren sat with his mother, the two of them speaking softly. She squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride. "No matter what happens," she said, "I'm proud of you. You stood up for yourself, and that's what matters." Darren nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced toward the courtroom, where Marcus Haynes would soon deliver a decision that could change everything. For Jessica, for Darren, and for everyone watching, the stakes had never felt higher. The tension was almost unbearable, but the answers they all sought were just beyond the courtroom doors, waiting to be revealed. The courtroom filled again as the recess ended, the buzz of hushed conversations dying down as Marcus Haynes returned to his seat at the bench. Everyone's eyes followed him, waiting for even the smallest hint of what his decision might be. Jessica Morgan sat straighter in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Darren Carter took a deep breath, his mother's hand resting reassuringly on his shoulder. Marcus cleared his throat, his gaze steady as he addressed the room. "Before I deliver my decision, there is one matter that needs clarification. During recess, additional information came to my attention. A new witness has stepped forward with evidence that may impact this case. I have reviewed the material and determined it relevant to these proceedings." The announcement sent a ripple through the room, murmurs rising as everyone tried to make sense of the development. Jessica's attorney immediately rose to his feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, introducing new evidence at this stage is highly irregular." Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Whitaker. However, the integrity of this case depends on a full and accurate understanding of the events in question. This witness testimony is critical." Jessica's face paled slightly, and she exchanged a glance with Paul, who looked equally unsettled. On the other side of the room, Darren leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he whispered to his attorney, "Who could it be?" The doors to the courtroom opened, and a man stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his expression calm but resolute. As he approached the witness stand, the room fell silent once again. "Please state your name for the record," Marcus said. "Detective Raymond Harris," the man replied, his voice steady. Jessica's head snapped toward him, her eyes widening in recognition. It was clear she hadn't expected this. Harris was a senior officer in her precinct, someone with years of experience and a reputation for fairness. "Detective Harris," Marcus continued, "you indicated that you have information pertinent to this case. Please proceed." Harris nodded, his gaze flickering briefly to Jessica before settling on the judge. "Your Honor, I've worked with Officer Morgan for several years. She's a capable officer, but there have been incidents in the past that raise concerns. I didn't come forward initially because I didn't think it was my place, but after seeing how this case has unfolded, I felt it was necessary." Jessica's breath hitched audibly, and Paul leaned over to whisper something to her, but she didn't respond. All eyes were on Harris as he continued. "During the traffic stop in question, Officer Morgan was aware that her dash cam wasn't functioning properly. She mentioned it in passing during our shift change that day." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus' expression remained neutral, but there was a sharpness in his eyes as he asked, "Did she take any steps to report this malfunction?" Harris hesitated before answering. "No, Your Honor. To my knowledge, no formal report was filed. This wasn't the first time such an issue occurred, but it's the first time it's come under scrutiny like this." Jessica shot to her feet, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. He's twisting the truth. I've worked with Harris for years, and he's never had an issue with how I handle things." "Officer Morgan," Marcus said firmly, cutting her off, "you will have an opportunity to respond. For now, sit down." Reluctantly, Jessica sank back into her seat, her face flushed. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as Harris continued his testimony, outlining other minor incidents that painted a troubling picture of Jessica's approach to authority and accountability. None of the incidents were severe on their own, but together they'd formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. For Darren, the revelation felt both validating and overwhelming. He had always suspected that Jessica's behavior during the traffic stop wasn't an isolated event, but hearing it confirmed by someone from within her own precinct was something else entirely. He glanced at his attorney, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. As Harris stepped down from the stand, Marcus sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. This new testimony raises serious questions about the events leading up to and following the traffic stop in question. I will need additional time to review this matter thoroughly before rendering a final decision." The announcement left the room in stunned silence. Marcus adjourned the session, and as people began to file out, the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Outside the courtroom, Jessica confronted Harris, her voice low but venomous. "Why would you do this? You know how hard I've worked to get here." Harris met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because it's not just about you, Jessica. It's about doing what's right. You crossed a line, and now it's time to face the consequences." Jessica turned away, her hands clenched into fists. Across the courtyard, Darren stood with his mother, watching the exchange from a distance. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope that justice might truly be within reach. But as he looked back toward the courthouse, he knew the fight was far from over. The stakes had been raised, and the final showdown was yet to come.